Forget what you think you know. That polished mahogany bar, the piano player, the smiling barkeep pouring smooth whiskey into a clean glass, the rowdy but harmless cowboys raising their hats to a pretty saloon girl. Hollywood spent 100 years building that image, and almost none of it is true. The real Wild West saloon was something far darker, far stranger, and in ways you've never been told, far more revealing about what America actually was in the 1800s. Subscribe and stay with us, because by the time we reach number 22, you'll never watch a Western the same way again. Number 1. The saloon was built before the church, before the school, before everything. In almost every Wild West town, the saloon didn't just arrive early, it arrived first. It wasn't uncommon for historic Western saloons to be the first business established in a new town, quickly followed by a general store, a blacksmith, and a church. Think about what that means. Before law, before medicine, before education, before God had a building. The saloon was already open, already serving, and already making money. The first saloon was established at Brown's Hole, Wyoming, in 1822, to serve fur trappers. From that single tent on the frontier, the institution exploded. By 1880, the growth of saloons was in full swing. In Leavenworth, Kansas alone, there were about 150 saloons and 4 wholesale liquor houses. 150 saloons in one town. The saloon wasn't a feature of frontier life. It was frontier life. Everything else was built around it. Number 2. The whiskey was designed to addict you. The whiskey served in most Wild West saloons had nothing in common with the smooth bourbon you see in movies. It was a homemade chemical concoction, and some of what went into it sounds more like a poison recipe than a drink. When a town was first founded, the initial saloons were often nothing more than tents or shacks that served homemade whiskey that included such ingredients as raw alcohol, burnt sugar, and chewing tobacco. But it got worse than that. If a barkeeper was ever going to water down his liquor, he did it with some really odd ingredients like turpentine, ammonia, gunpowder, or cayenne pepper. Turpentine, in the whiskey. The names cowboys gave these drinks tell you everything. They called it coffin varnish, gut warmer, joy juice, and bottled courage. Names that were funny until you understood they were also accurate. And the chewing tobacco mixed into the alcohol, that delivered a nicotine hit alongside the alcohol hit, a dual addiction engineered before anyone even understood addiction as a concept. People didn't just want another drink, their body was demanding it. Number 3. The saloon girls were serving you tea and charging you for whiskey. Here's a con so good it ran for decades across hundreds of saloons, and almost nobody figured it out. Saloon girls, the women hired to dance, sing, and keep men company, were a crucial part of the business model. After every dance, they steered their partners straight to the bar and encouraged them to buy a round. What the cowboy didn't know was what was actually in the girl's glass. Drinks bought for the girls were only cold tea or colored sugar water, served in a shot glass. However, the customer was charged the full price of whiskey, which ranged from 10 to 75 cents a shot. The saloon owner made full whiskey profit on a glass of cold tea. The girl kept her commission. The cowboy, already drunk on the real stuff, never noticed the difference. A popular girl could average as many as 50 dances a night. Often they could make more in a night than a working man could make in a month. The saloon girl wasn't just entertainment. She was the most sophisticated sales mechanism in the building, and she was sober the entire time she was working it. Number 4. The free lunch was a trap, and it invented modern marketing. Walk into almost any saloon in the 1870s and 1880s, and you'd find a table of food waiting for you, completely free. Pickled eggs, sausages, salted meat, bread, crackers. No charge. Just eat. Which offered a meal at no cost in order to attract customers and increase revenues from other offerings. These establishments included a free lunch, varying from rudimentary to quite elaborate, with the purchase of at least one drink. But here's what the saloon owner knew that you didn't. Every item on that table was soaked in salt. The saltier the food, the thirstier you became. The thirstier you became, the more drinks you ordered, and every drink was pure profit. The saloon keeper relied on the expectation that most customers would buy. This wasn't hospitality, it was behavioral engineering, a deliberate manipulation of human physiology to extract maximum spending. We'd call it a loss leader marketing strategy today. The phrase, "there's no such thing as a free lunch," was literally born in these saloons, and it meant exactly what it said. Number 5. Faro. The game everyone played and almost nobody understood. Hollywood gave you poker. The reality of the Wild West gave you something completely different. Faro was the most popular and prolific game played in Old West saloons, followed by Brag, three-card Monte, and dice games such as High-Low, Chuck-a-Luck, and Grand Hazard. Faro used a special deck, a betting board, and a dealing box that could be, and routinely was, rigged. Professional dealers used fixed boxes that gave the house complete control over which card appeared. Players had no way to detect it from across the table. But the most disturbing part of Faro wasn't the cheating. It was who was running the tables. Wyatt Earp worked in or owned several saloons during his lifetime. During January 1881, Oriental Saloon owner Lou Rickabaugh gave Wyatt Earp a 1/4 interest in the Faro concession at the Oriental Saloon in exchange for his services as a manager and enforcer. Wyatt invited his friend Bat Masterson to Tombstone to help him run the Faro tables. The most famous lawman of the Wild West was running gambling tables. The line between the sheriff and the house was thinner than a playing card. Number 6. The bartender was the most powerful man in town. In most frontier towns, the bartender held more real power than the mayor, the sheriff, and the preacher combined. He knew every secret. He heard every deal. He knew who was broke, who was armed, who was planning to leave town in the night, and who had made enemies at the card table the week before. The better class of saloons employed staff to handle the myriad jobs. The chain of command started at the top with the saloon owner. Next came the bartenders, who were valued for their drink mixing and people skills, and considered themselves professionals. There was even a bartenders' union. A bartenders' union in the Wild West. While most of the country had no labor rights whatsoever, the bartender also functioned as an informal bank, extending credit to regulars. As an informal therapist, listening to confessions that no priest ever heard. And as an informal judge, deciding who got served, who got cut off, and who got quietly told to leave before someone got hurt. The bartender played a crucial role in the saloon. He was not just a server of drinks, but also a keeper of the peace. Bartenders had to be tough and able to handle rowdy customers. They were often among the most respected and well-known figures in town. In a world with unreliable law enforcement and no social services, the bartender held the town together, one drink at a time. Number 7. Saloons doubled as courtrooms, and judges ordered hangings from the bar. Because saloons were often the largest and most central buildings in frontier towns, they became the default venue for anything requiring a public gathering. Church services when no church existed, town elections, community meetings, and most dramatically, courts of law. Judge Roy Bean had a combination saloon and courtroom from which he ran his business and ordered hangings. Downeyville, California had a popular saloon, which also served as the office of the local justice of the peace. The Judge Roy Bean Saloon, depicted in 1900, doubled as a hall of justice, where men gathered to witness the trial of a horse thief. Think about what that scene looked like. A man on trial for his life, surrounded by drunk patrons, the smell of tobacco and rot-gut whiskey, gambling chips still on the table, while the judge who would decide his fate stood behind the same bar that had served everyone their drinks an hour earlier. Justice in the Wild West wasn't blind. It was often drunk. Number 8. The racial rules were brutal and absolute. Hollywood's saloon is a room where everyone mingles freely. Cowboys, outlaws, lawmen, strangers, all drinking side by side. The reality was a rigidly segregated institution that reflected and enforced the racial hierarchy of 19th century America with unambiguous cruelty. Saloons in the West did not welcome people of other races. Indians were excluded by law. An occasional black man might begrudgingly be accepted, or at least ignored, if he happened to be a noted gambler or outlaw. If a Chinese man entered a saloon, he risked his life. Read that again. A Chinese man entering a saloon risked his life, not his dignity, not his comfort, his life. This was happening at the same time that Chinese laborers were literally building the transcontinental railroad that connected the country, doing some of the most dangerous work in American history, and could be killed for walking through the wrong door at the end of the day. Every working-class saloon attracted its own particular clientele: Irish, Germans, blacks, cowboys. This form of segregation was maintained mostly by mutual agreement, not by law, but woe to the man who carelessly violated the unwritten rule. The saloon didn't invent American racism, but it enforced it every single night, one refused drink at a time. Number 9. Black saloons existed, and history buried them. Here is the part of saloon history that almost no one teaches. Because black men and women were excluded from white saloons, they built their own. In 1997, archaeologists discovered that the Bucket of Blood Saloon in Virginia City was constructed over another saloon, the Boston Saloon. The Boston Saloon was owned by William Brown, who was a freed slave from Massachusetts. A freed slave built a saloon. It was buried under another saloon for over a century, and archaeologists had to dig it out of the ground before history would acknowledge it existed. Black-owned saloons served black cowboys, miners, and laborers, a community that represented roughly 1 in 4 cowboys on the frontier, but almost 0% of the Western mythology Hollywood created. These establishments were community centers, safe spaces, and economic anchors for people who had been legally freed but practically excluded from every public institution around them. They were real, they were significant, and they were almost completely erased. Number 10. Soldiers were banned, and the reason is darker than you think. There was one more group that was unwelcome in most Wild West saloons, and it wasn't outlaws, it was soldiers. Soldiers weren't usually welcomed in Western saloons. They were seen as representing the state and were often blamed for spreading venereal diseases to the saloon girls. Given the makeup of the many men of the West, adventurers, people who didn't fit in the East, outlaws and Civil War deserters, they had no respect for the men who represented the authority of a government. Many of them had specifically fled. The frontier was full of men running from something. A uniform was a reminder of everything they'd left behind, or everything that was coming to collect them. The soldier represented the law, and the saloon, for all its codes and customs, was fundamentally a place where the law did not fully reach. Number 11. The Birdcage Theater ran a poker game for 8 years straight. In Tombstone, Arizona, there was a saloon unlike any other. The Birdcage Theater, part saloon, part gambling hall, part theater, part brothel, became one of the most extraordinary establishments in the history of the American West. The Birdcage's non-stop poker game reportedly ran for 8 years straight. 8 years, without stopping. Day and night, through gunfights and deaths, through the boom and eventual collapse of Tombstone's silver economy, through the famous events at the OK Corral, the poker game continued. Players rotated in and out. The stakes ranged from modest to catastrophic. Fortunes changed hands across that table in a room that never fully closed, never fully quieted, never fully slept. The walls of the Birdcage still hold the bullet holes from that era, 26 of them by the last count. Legends of hauntings still draw visitors today, which may say more about what people want the past to be than what it actually was. But the poker game, that part is documented history. Number 12. The drinking codes were as strict as any law. Forget the idea of the lawless saloon where anything goes. Inside those walls, a rigid set of unwritten rules governed every interaction, and violating them could get you killed faster than drawing on the wrong man. Asking a stranger about his past was absolutely forbidden. Where a man came from, what he'd done, who he'd left behind, these were questions you did not ask. The frontier attracted men reinventing themselves, and that reinvention was protected by social code. Men of the West usually did not drink alone, nor did they drink at home. Needing each other's company, there were many regulars at the many saloons. And chief among the unwritten rules, when someone bought a round, you drank. Refusing a drink from a man who'd offered one was considered a personal insult, an accusation that you thought yourself better than him. In a room full of armed, proud, and often drunk men, that insult had a very short distance to travel before it became violence. The saloon had rules. They just weren't written in any law book. Number 13. Opium dens operated behind the back wall. The whiskey and gambling were the public face of the saloon. Behind closed doors, in back rooms that didn't appear on any official record, many saloons operated a darker trade entirely. Saloons quickly gained notoriety as hubs of vice. Saloons often housed brothels and opium dens. Opium was legal in the United States until 1909. It was sold openly in pharmacies as a component of patent medicines. And in the back rooms of frontier saloons, particularly in towns with large Chinese populations who had introduced the practice, opium pipes were available for a price. A man could walk through the front door for a whiskey, lose his wages at the Faro table, and end the night in a back room in a chemically induced stupor that would keep him horizontal until morning. There was no intervention, no regulation, no closing time on the pipe. The saloon didn't just take your money. In its darkest corners, it took everything else too. Number 14. A painting almost caused a murder, and did cause one. In Abilene, Kansas, in 1871, a saloon owner made a decision about exterior decoration that set off a chain of events ending in 2 deaths. Phil Coe, the owner of the Bull's Head Tavern in Abilene, Kansas, outraged the townspeople by painting a bull, complete with an erect on the outside wall of his tavern. The marshal at the time, Wild Bill Hickok, threatened to burn the saloon to the ground if the offending animal was not painted over. Instead, he hired some men to do the job, which angered Coe. The two became enemies, and in a later altercation, Wild Bill Hickok, Coe, a painting on a wall. That was the beginning. But the end was darker still. Wild Bill, having Coe that October night, then heard footsteps running toward him in the darkness and fired again. The man he shot this time was his own deputy, his friend, a man named Mike Williams who had run toward the sound of gunfire to help. Wild Bill Hickok accidentally killed his own deputy in the chaos following a confrontation that started with a painting of a bull. He never fired his guns in anger again. He was found dead 5 years later, shot in the back of the head at a poker table in Deadwood. Number 15. The sawdust on the floor wasn't for decoration. Every saloon floor in the Wild West was covered in sawdust. Movies kept this detail, but nobody explained why. It wasn't aesthetic, it wasn't tradition. It was a hygiene solution for a hygiene catastrophe. The sawdust absorbed spilled drinks, tobacco spit, blood from fights, and in the rougher establishments, whatever else ended up on the floor during a long night. Proprietors emptied spittoons whenever they got around to it, and men relieved themselves in either a back alley or a nearby privy. The sawdust was changed when the owner remembered to change it. In the busiest establishments during cattle drive season, that might be days between cleanings. Underneath the sawdust, the wooden floorboards soaked up everything that the sawdust missed. The smell in a crowded frontier saloon in July: unwashed men, warm beer, tobacco smoke, horse manure tracked in from the street, and whatever the sawdust was absorbing, was something no movie has ever found a way to represent. The swinging doors weren't dramatic. They were ventilation, desperately needed ventilation. Number 16. The Gem Saloon in Deadwood was run by a criminal empire. Not all saloons were rough-edged, but essentially honest businesses. Some were criminal operations wearing the costume of a saloon. The Gem Saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota, run by the notorious Al Swearingen, was infamous for its violence and vice. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost, and where the line between lawman and outlaw was often blurred. Swearingen lured women to Deadwood with newspaper advertisements promising respectable employment as actresses, as performers, as housekeepers. When they arrived, he made clear what their actual job would be. Those who refused faced violence. Those who complied were kept in conditions close to indentured servitude, their earnings controlled, their movements restricted. The Gem burned down twice. Each time, Swearingen rebuilt it. It was too profitable to abandon. Swearingen died in 1904, struck by a streetcar in Denver, penniless, far from the empire he'd built in Deadwood's most notorious address. The Gem Saloon lasted longer in television than it did in reality, but the real version was darker than any script dared to show. Number 17. Soapy Smith ran a criminal empire from his saloon bar. Jefferson Randolph Smith, known as Soapy, was perhaps the most sophisticated criminal the saloon world ever produced. Notorious con artist and crime boss Jefferson Soapy Smith ran his criminal operations from his saloon in Skagway, Alaska, before he was in a spectacular shootout. Soapy's saloon was the headquarters of a criminal network that included fake telegraph offices that charged men to send messages to their families, but weren't connected to any telegraph line, rigged gambling tables, a network of informants who identified newly arrived gold rush prospectors and directed them toward Soapy's various traps. He controlled Skagway's local government. He intimidated witnesses. He paid off officials. All of it run from behind a saloon bar in plain sight, while he played the role of generous community figure, donating to churches, feeding stray dogs, buying rounds for the house. He was in a gunfight in 1898. The criminal empire collapsed within hours. Without Soapy behind the bar holding it together, the whole architecture of corruption simply fell apart. Number 18. Regular customers grew calluses from leaning on the bar. This detail sounds almost comic, but it says something profound about the role the saloon played in the lives of the men who lived on the frontier. The regulars at saloons often developed calluses on their elbows from prolonged, heavy leaning on the bar. Men of the West usually did not drink alone, nor did they drink at home. Needing each other's company, there were many regulars at the many saloons. Calluses, from leaning on a bar, from being there so often, staying so long, that the body physically adapted to the posture. For many men on the frontier, far from their families, working brutal physical labor in isolation for months at a time, the saloon was the only social world they had. It was the only place where anyone knew their name, where conversation was available, where the crushing loneliness of frontier life temporarily lifted. The drinking was real, but underneath it, what many of these men were actually consuming wasn't whiskey. It was human contact. Number 19. Women owned saloons and ran them better than the men. The story Hollywood never tells is the one where women are running the whole operation. Across the frontier, women owned and managed saloons with a business acumen that put many of their male counterparts to shame. Poker Alice Ivers, a British-born card player who won $6,000 in a single night, eventually owned and operated her own establishment in the Dakotas. Maddie Silks in Denver built and ran an entire network of establishments that made her one of the wealthiest women in Colorado. It was rare for saloon girls to double as prostitutes. In fact, many ladies of ill repute found they could make more money as a dance hall girl. And the owners knew it. Saloon owners lost a lot of employees to marriage because a successful dance hall girl had economic independence that made her a highly desirable partner, and a married woman generally didn't return to the dance floor. These women navigated a world with no legal protections, no property rights for much of the period, and no institutional support. And some of them built fortunes anyway. The saloon gave certain women the only path to financial independence available to them. The fact that history remembers almost none of their names is its own kind of injustice. Number 20. The temperance. Women fought back with hatchets. For every man who celebrated the saloon, there was a woman outside it, furious. The temperance movement of the late 1800s wasn't abstract political activism. For many women, it was personal. Husbands who drank the family's wages, children going hungry while their fathers leaned on bars, developing elbow calluses. No legal right to divorce. No financial independence without a husband's income. Saloons were frequent targets of the temperance movement, which saw them as dens of vice and immorality. Reformers lobbied for stricter laws, and by the early 20th century, the push for prohibition was well underway. But Carrie Nation didn't lobby. She picked up a hatchet. Beginning in 1900, Nation physically entered saloons in Kansas, then a legally dry state with openly operating illegal bars, and destroyed them. Smashing bottles, breaking mirrors, tearing down bars with her hatchet and her bare hands while singing hymns. She was arrested over 30 times. She paid her fines by selling souvenir hatchet pins. Beginning in 1893, the Anti-Saloon League began protesting against American saloons. In 1895, it became a national organization and quickly rose to become the most powerful prohibition lobby in America. The 18th Amendment, prohibition, became law in 1920. The women the saloon had excluded and impoverished for 50 years ultimately shut it down entirely. Number 21. The most famous death in saloon history might have the wrong hand of cards. On August 2nd, 1876, in Deadwood's Saloon Number 10, Wild Bill Hickok made the only mistake that ever cost him anything. He sat with his back to the door. Wild Bill was on August 2nd 1876, by Jack McCall, who shot him in the back of the head in Saloon number 10 in Deadwood, South Dakota, as Wild Bill was playing cards. His hand, aces and eights, according to tradition, has become known as the dead man's hand. Aces and eights, the dead man's hand. One of the most famous details in the entire mythology of the Wild West. But here's what historians have quietly noted for decades. The accounts of exactly which cards Hickok held were not recorded immediately. The specific detail of aces and eights emerged and solidified over time through retellings and newspaper accounts, not from an eyewitness inventory of cards on the table. The dead man's hand may be historically accurate, or it may be the most successful piece of frontier legend building in American history. Either way, every poker player who draws aces and eights today is honoring the death of a man who was shot from behind in a saloon by someone with a grudge and nothing left to lose. Number 22. The saloon didn't die. It became everything around you. Prohibition shut the saloons down in 1920. The batwing doors stopped swinging. The Faro tables were folded away. The sawdust was swept up for the last time. But the saloon didn't really die. It became the American bar, the sports pub, the neighborhood tavern. The place where people go not primarily for the alcohol, but for the same reason men leaned on those sticky frontier bars until they grew calluses on their elbows. To be around other people, to talk, to forget, for a few hours, how hard everything is. The whiskey got better. The floor got cleaner. Women were allowed through the front door. Most of the racial exclusions were eventually made illegal. But the essential function, the saloon as the place a community gathers when it has nowhere else to go, never changed. It was the first building in every frontier town for a reason. And in one form or another, it outlasted everything else that was built around it. Tell me in the comments, which secret hit you hardest? The black saloons buried under history, the poker game that ran for 8 years straight, or the women who ultimately destroyed the whole institution with a hatchet? If this is the kind of history nobody taught you, subscribe, because we're just getting started.